bass.
Welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm. This is the interview show that gets deep in the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. I am your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine. If you enjoy this programming, subscribe to the Funk and Stuff channel on YouTube, which is where Truth and Rhythm lives, and be an advocate by spreading the word among fellow funk, jazz, and R&B music lovers. Join Truth and Rhythm's membership program through Patreon. You can also submit a direct donation to the cause anytime at funkandstuff.net. At that site, you can also purchase the book Everything's on the One, The First Guide of Funk. Shop for official Truth and Rhythm and Funk and Stuff merchandise, and use the Amazon links for all of your online purchases, which allocates a percentage to this show. For those of you who go the extra step in supporting the show, you have my heartfelt gratitude for allowing us to continue to shine the light on those special artists whose quest is to find truth in rhythm.
I'm very happy to welcome to the Truth and Rhythm Mothership, Rickey Vincent, an author, radio show host, educator, and funk music's best-known historian and advocate. His beloved book, entitled Funk, the Music, the People, and the Rhythm of the One, right there, dropped in 1996. And since 1997, he has shared new and classic songs through the History of Funk radio show on KPFA, which airs Friday nights at 10 p.m. Pacific time. Through the years, he has penned liner notes for several album reissues. We're in his second book, titled Party Music, The Inside Story of the Black Panthers Band and How Black Power Transformed Soul Music. He's appeared in documentaries and articles, and in 2016, he even cut his own album called Fool for the Funk. Rickey, man, my longtime brother from another mother, for sure. It's so great to have you.
It's wonderful to be here, Scott. And again, I'm honored to be a part of your wall of game, all the people that you be checking with. It's great. It's great work that you do. And it's just great to be immersed in funk so deep. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I feel like we ran these parallel lives, you know, in California, you up in the north, me in the south. I think, did you graduate in 79? High school?
I was graduated in 79, and same for you?
Yeah, same. So we were like right in sync, you know, and right around 74-ish is when the funk called me, you know, and it was never the same, you know, thank goodness.
Yeah, because we heard it on the radio back in the day. And that was, my brother was bringing home singles that were messing with my head. But I heard Up for the Downstroke on the radio in 1974, and nothing's been the same since. You know, it's been a quest to sort of to return to that moment of getting spanked by the one like that, and I keep going back to it. I have to explain. Well, what is the fun? Well, what is the one? Can you explain the one? Go back to Up for the Downstroke, and that thing has just got the boom that you need, and everything goes from there as far as I'm concerned.
You remember what was the first album that you kind of bought on your own with your own money back then?
Well, there was I was really into Jungle Boogie and Hollywood Swinging, and how Kool and the Gang had sort of they kept coming with Wild and Peaceful. It kept happening. So much was going on. And I don't know, I think maybe my brother already bought it. And then I was in I think my high school counselor wanted me to have some guidance. So I had to follow somebody that was in college up at Cal, because I was at Berkeley High. And this guy, he was a cool guy, but he was a music snob. And he kept saying that the music I was into was just, bubblegum and juvenile and this and that and the other. And so partly because I love this record and partly because I wanted to impress this guy, I paid my own money and bought Light of Worlds by Kool and the Gang. And that's the album that had Summer Madness. And that was maybe 2 or 3 years old by then, but some of us knew that was a legendary record right away. And we said, this thing is decades ahead of its time. And Summer Madness has borne that out. And so even then I recognized that, wait, this has some masterful jazz chops while bringing that thunder funk. And there's larger issues of how a lot of people were trying to be like Earth, Wind, and Fire and show some spirituality and some groove allegiance at the same time. And so I said, this is worth it for me. This is a thing to do, and I'm going to show this guy so he can't talk about me. And so that was the first record. There was Intervisions was in the house already, and then the first record I bought was Light of Worlds, and that kind of set a standard. So every time I'm looking at a LTD album or a Bar-Kays album, I can kind of measure it by how much are they reaching? Are they just trying to get paid, or are they reaching for something internal, external, spiritual they want to say at the same time? And the funk is capable of all of those things.
Mm-hmm. So Light of Worlds, was Higher Plane on that?
Say what?
Light of Worlds, was Higher Plane on that one? That record?
Higher Plane was on there.
Yeah.
Rhyme Time People was on there. And the opening track was Street Corner Symphony. And that is one of their kind of one-off, just thunder funk jams that, that's what the artists did back in the day. They tried to get on the radio with this, that, and the other. And then for the funk of it, they would just go for the big bomb. And whether that became a single or not, it didn't matter. That was the beautiful thing about it. A lot of these artists, they were making music to make what they wanted to make. And they adapted to the market, but they were making it because it had to come from them. It had to happen. And that wasn't hard to see. It wasn't hard to spot. Maybe it's because I grew up around the musician. My brother was a keyboard player, and he was a few years older than me, and he had the clavinet, right? The thing that Stevie Wonder played on Superstition, that had that outer space, Billy Preston type of thing. And so he had those chops and a Fender Rhodes piano, and then a Moog synthesizer, that little one, mini Moog. And so he would just kind of casually explain, what so-and-so is doing and how they're using it and why and things like that. And so without really taking notes, I was like hearing some of the inside of how this stuff was done and why. And then hearing his horror stories about bands he was in. It wasn't hard to gain a kind of a pulse of when somebody is putting a record together to get a paycheck, and when somebody is inspired, and when somebody sort of found a groove, they just vary it in separate ways. Take an album like The World Is a Ghetto by War. Those cats were inspired from beginning to end of the whole project, right? And sometimes you could tell where they're just sort of punching the clock, and they're so good they can do it anyway. But there's a difference, and that's part of the fun of the hunt.
And it was so gloriously competitive then with those bands. They were all trying to outdo each other, and they were copying each other's licks and things and bringing it to different places. And that whole like melting pot that was happening was just amazing.
It was an incredible story, and it was hard to know when it was friendly, loving competition, and when it was a little more sinister competition. That's like, no, we own this town, and we're gonna have to let them know today that this is how it's gonna go down and stuff like that. But when you think about it, that works in a lot of venues, that works in basketball, that works in a lot of other places. And at the end of the day, it's all love, and that's all that they're doing. And the point is, for me, is that folks had their own kind of control over the operation. They're like, this is a design we want to do. And Greg Boyer said this just off the cuff. We were talking to him because he's back with P-Funk and just as lively as ever. And we got into talking about the music business, and he said back in the day, an artist would create some kind of work, and then the market people had to figure out how to market what the artist made, as opposed to the other way around, where the market people tell them this is what you can and can't do, and we're going to market it that way, and they kind of know that going in. So it's completely the opposite of that nowadays. But back then, we believed in the artists, and they knew it. And when they worked, like you said, with each other, we knew that there was something special about the energy, the community, the vibes that each group had, and how they were delivering it to their audience and to one another as colleagues, co-conspirators, funketeers, whatever it was. So yeah, that was just such a beautiful time, man. And I wish there was more stories about it. I wish there was more documentation about that time. Mm-hmm. I'm starting to collect, we're both on Facebook, and it's every now and then some, kind of action picture from a big stage show that maybe we hadn't seen before and things like that. And so I'm kind of always looking for the stadium shots where they're on stage and you can kind of see in the background thousands of people. And I mean, yeah, every group has had some hot days, and every group has been on a lineup that maybe someone else was headlining, but still, these were big events, and they deserve to be recognized and documented somehow, some way, because they were there. These things happen. And how can you transform everything musically, culturally, and then just move along like nothing happened? So it's important, I think, to really compile and catalog the epic scale of those Grand Funk years. And I don't mean the band Grand Funk. That's a different story.
Anyone sitting on vintage footage from back then, shame on you. You got to release it, get it out here for the public good, because there's just way too little, footage of, prime Isley Brothers or prime, at least Ohio Players were on some of the TV shows. Right. But there are other bands that didn't really do that, and you just can't find that footage.
It's a tough one. And I remember there was a lot of, and people still do it. There are folks that still look for rare recordings, audio. And I don't know if there is a community of people that is hunting down video in the same way. There was a guy up in the Bay, his name is Calvin Lincoln, and he was recognized. He's still around, and he does a lot of this. He had a cable access TV show called Soul School, and he would run bootleg videos of, Ain't Gonna Hurt Nobody by Brick, on Soul Train, played live, things like that. And you're like, whoa, I'd never seen that. And so he would just do, cable access TV this is well before YouTube, right? It was well before any of that. But it was this window into this stuff. And he became known to the folks doing shows like Unsung. And he would provide them with like the the most available version of some video of a band that they were trying to do. So he was that way. He was connected, and I think he tracks a lot of that stuff down. He's got a lot of connects with bootleggers around the world that would help him. And I'm like, why does this have to be a bootleg thing? Why does it have to be so underground? Why can't it be a big thing that's part of a big archive, that's a big room in some R&B museum with a budget? Maybe in another generation, something like that that story will get told. But for now, it's kind of connecting the dots. I'm finally starting to think about, maybe the fog is lifting from all the I'll just say it, all the weed I was smoking in high school. And I went to so many shows, it's all a blur now. But you can kind of unpack it a little bit and say, yeah, I remember, I think Brass Construction opened for the Isley Brothers that day when they played the Coliseum, and boom, boom, boom. And I remember the Blackbirds were at the Coliseum in tuxedos for reasons I don't understand, but there's a whole other conversation, but they were more of a jazz band that just, they hit a vibe doing funk so well. It was ahead of them, really. Their demands, I think the demands for the Blackbirds exceeded what they expected, and they weren't necessarily into the packaging like some of these other acts were. But it was just a beautiful, and so there they are on the road, with all these bands that knew what the show was about. And it was subtle, but it was like, those guys are jamming, wait, these guys are hit, boom, 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 boom. And we didn't necessarily know where everybody was coming from, other than what we could read on liner notes, not liner notes, but just album cover information. And I didn't subscribe to them, but a lot of folks, Scott, I don't know if you did, a lot of folks were reading like Blues and Soul magazine, and there were a handful of R&B fanzines that could give you inside information. I'd read Jet as much as I could, but usually it would be, I'm looking for the honey of the week more than the bands. But then if something popped up, I would kind of pay attention to that. And nowadays those are gems. Some of those stories, those real insightful stories from folks that loved the groups, were there, we're vibing on them, and every one of those is saying this is one of the great albums of all time, and you're like, yeah, that's just promotion. But when you think about it, 50 years later, those were some of the great albums of all time.
I always wondered on Jet. I used to look at all those magazines. Most of my time, Ricky, was split between the record store and the newsstand, either reading about funk or seeing what I could find in the bins that maybe I hadn't heard of before. Jet, I always wondered how they came up with that chart that they did, because it always seemed to be so counter to, the publications that were out there, the record industry publications.
Like, hey, Tyrone, you want to do the countdown this week? Okay, you go do it. I'm tired. I mean, that's what it seemed like. It was somebody who was just hanging out and put their favorite songs on the list. And that's okay, because that's what it did. And now we go back to that, like it's, the hieroglyphic scrolls of the past. But it was all love. And to this day, when I look at one of those Jet countdowns, as much as I can say, I got all those records, there was always one that I never heard of when it's on that list. Like, I never heard of that one. Jimmy McCracken. I didn't know who that is. What? It's just, there was always one that snuck in there. It's like, dang, I don't have that. And that just had you back at the store, just crate digging, your heart out just to see where it comes up. But it was funny. You kind of knew what you were looking for, but you didn't. And that's okay. And the more I kind of get in the jazz crate digging loop, there's a sensibility coming out of the jazz and the fusion world that it's okay to expect something you've never heard, expect something that's out of your boundaries. This is beyond what you've been thinking and stuff like that. And so I really enjoyed how that made its way into, or the bands that were doing that, like Kool and the Gang or Mandrill or some of these people, they were trying to reach a middle ground, but we knew they were further out, and they were trying to stretch you out and stretch out musically. And to me, that was a beautiful combo play, mix and match, the way people did that kind of thing. And not everybody was happy with it, and I wasn't entirely happy with it. But I remember the day I came across like a funk record that had nothing but funk beats on it and didn't have a ballad or a gospel tune or a weird kind of jazzy thing that interrupted everything. And it was just all just groove tracks. And it was like a kind of a sweet and sour moment, because it said, the groove is more important than anything, but then it also said all that everything else that's part of the ingredients in the recipe, all that's no longer as important. And so I go back and forth with that. And every now and then we run into artists that still mix it up a lot, right? I'm out here in the Bay where Ron Cat and the Catdelic does their thing. And he does the rockabilly, he does, the heavy metal, he does the straight Rick James style funk, he does, a lot of soft ballads in his set, right? All of that. And I'm like, I feel a comfort zone with that, even if only half the tracks might wind up on my radio show, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, that kind of variety is what made Sly and Prince so great too. Was bringing in all those different kinds of music and still being as funky as hell, and
quietly demanding something of the audience to recognize that. And one of the last Prince shows I went to, there were these folks that were jamming and partying to the club hits and just swooning to the ballads. And then when he plugged in and started doing his guitar work, they're like, okay, let's go get a drink. And they went off because they weren't really ready for all those dimensions of him. And I'm like, they're missing out. It's all connected, damn it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you mentioned so many things, Ricky, but so your brother was how many years older than you?
He was 2 years older than me.
Okay, so pretty close.
Well, age-wise, we're close, but he had a band, and he was just like, I'm doing real stuff. You're just playing around. I play the keyboard, you play the record player. And so he kept a distinction between them, just like without really thinking about it. It was just big brother stuff. And so it wasn't like, here, come along, let me show you these chord changes and boom, 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 boom. There might have been a little bit of that. But so I just looked up to those guys, and they were these mystical characters to me. And these are all down to earth, just, musicians that you might, if you imagine that Earth, Wind and Fire movie with That's the Way of the World, and those guys hopping in that van, and you could just kind of smell the cocoa butter on them and all that stuff. That they just that was a big part of the community that I came from, and those are musicians. And then once I got to know them, I just couldn't believe how just they were deep love philosophy, thinkers and spiritual people that were when I was a kid, I was intimidated. They looked like tough guys from the block, but at the same time, they're these spiritual artists that were doing this fusion of styles and everything. To me, they were all trying to do what Paul Jackson and Mike Clark and the Headhunters were doing, which is the sound that is just raw and mean and yet full of, love and soul at the same time. And so I was kind of spoiled by a lot of that, and the kind of distance allowed me to sort of elevate, sort of I could see them as this sort of lofty entity that sort of came out of the ground. They sort of did it themselves. And then I recognized when bands would be seeking that same thing when I came across them. And so I could see why there were bands. There were so many more unsuccessful bands, Scott, than the ones that we play and put in the mix all the time. And why did they do that? Because there was something they were seeking. They was trying to express something that was collective, that was in the moment, but it was tied to all these histories and traditions. And the traditions, I think, reflect all the histories, but they were connecting. Everybody was connecting. Everybody was blending, but not blending like in a blender. They were blending. They were following Sly Stone's example, Stevie Wonder's example, Curtis Mayfield's example. They were following, how can I say all of these things and bring all these things together? And some people, did some, just the mechanism of it is what was so magic for me, the way people did it. And then they got it done, they got it run, they got some hits, got on the radio, that's cool too. But I was always interested in the mechanics of how these people came together to produce something that was greater than the sum of the parts. And but one thing I noticed out here in the Bay, because you mentioned Sly, and we always mention Sly, there were a lot of bands that wanted to be a Sly Stone type band, wanted to do a Sly Stone type or a Grand Central Station type band, which was, we knew that was kind of Sly and Family Stone 2.0 in the 70s, but there was no Sly. There was no next Sly for a variety of reasons. And so there was a lot of great music, a lot of exciting bands, a lot of great times. And it would just depend on what day you're like, ooh, this is nice, I'm having a good time. Ooh, this is kind of cool. If only they had somebody with Sly's talent, this would take it to the next level. And I keep thinking about that. Tower of Power was huge, but their best years are when they had Lenny Williams, right? And there's great band, great time, they're cool. And then I'm like, oh, but the Lenny Williams years, oh, and I would go back and forth with that. But that's part of that is your love, and then part of that is your music snobbery, and you want to, you kind of have to be cognizant of that, and sometimes make sure you let go of that.
Well, I think in hearing, listening to you, Rickey, and also reading your posts and things like that, I think both of us have eased back a little bit from back in the day where we were both pretty, it's either bona fide funk or it's, a sellout or whatever, but to go back and sort of, lighten up a little bit and better appreciate the economics and, things like that, and just what else was going on and have a broader perspective of it. I think, I can appreciate better some of the other stuff that back then I was really dismissive of. And also I can better respect some of the artists for some of the decisions that they might have made. I still wish that a lot of them would have done more funk, but
right.
I get it,
I get it. And the last time I saw Kool and the Gang, and that was when Khalid Bayan was still there, and DT was still there, um, and Funky George. I think he came out because he doesn't play the whole set anymore. I think only Cool plays the whole set with the band, and they do a seamless mix, really, of their pop stuff. They bring in youngsters to do that, and then the youngsters take a break, and then they would get into some of the OG, uh, soul vibrations, love the life you live type of stuff. And Summer Madness they would always play, and then I think it was George that got out there and said, some people say they almost have a disclaimer. Some people say, we sold out when we made this other music, but we paid for all our houses, paid for all our kids to go to college, and whoop 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 whoop, and had a good time, and we're still here now playing the music that we love from back in the day. And they didn't always spell that all the way out, but you can say that's what we're doing here. Doing that allowed us to be able to be here 50 years later playing our favorites for you. And so I think they had that worked out, and they have the pitch about that kind of worked out, that they probably had to, they have had decades to work on that. But it just made me love them even more, because there was a time when we were just like, this
Like
is
betrayed almost.
yeah, sacrilege. How dare you? And I saw them once when they had the lead singer guy, JT, right, James Taylor, and he was at a San Francisco club. I think it was the I-Beam or one of those San Francisco clubs, and he was like, "What y'all want to hear?" And somebody said, "Funky Granny." That might have been me. He said, "Well, there'll be no Funky Granny here tonight," because I guess at that time they were still riding, the pop thing. With so much access to all the music, anybody that clicks Kool and the Gang, they're going to find their latest album, which is pretty good. All their 80s pop, and then when they hit that mother lode, that wild and peaceful music is the message, light of worlds period, spirit of the boogie. I mean, whoa, this is some hidden information that people kept from me all this time. And that's just kind of how it goes. And again, I wish it wasn't such top secret information. I wish it wasn't so hidden and hard to bring about, and hard to recover for people to kind of see how all these pieces fit, because we're so far from it, man. 50 years. But it's now people can kind of see how more clearly how it's all connected. And just the fact that, and I do this when I teach my classes, I said there was a thing of an artist putting a variety of sounds together on a record. And I tell my students, most of you have a playlist or an artist that you like, and you've got 25 tracks that are the same style, the same beat, the same, kind of sound. And I try not to judge it. And I just say, there was a time when it was up to the artist to show how broad their range is, not how they can consistently do one thing, and just leave it there and let people make their own choices.
As I'm thinking about this and we're talking, it occurs to me that back then, when those groups were doing that and those artists were doing that, if maybe there was the kind of communication there's today that artists have access to with their audience, I would have better understood, because I would have heard some direct messaging from them why they're making certain decisions and why they're doing certain things. Back then, especially the black acts, they didn't get much ink, unless you really sought it out. And if you did find it, it was probably going to mostly just be really hyping whatever was new, and not really getting into some of the nitty gritty of what was going on inside their heads and why they were doing certain things creatively,
And it's tricky because sometimes he's like, ooh, and Scott, I'm sure you've done it. It's like, ooh, I get to interview so-and-so who was there in 1973. And then you ask them and they just sort of fuzzy about or mystical about the whole thing. And they don't necessarily, they can't bring back that moment that when all these ideas were flying and the urgency was there to say something and be something and become something and share that becoming with your audience and all those things that you may not get it that way. I used to hate when Don Cornelius would do interviews on Soul Train because he has kind of a droll way of asking questions. And it took me a minute and a lot of reruns to watch before I realized he can, like when he introduces a band, he hypes them like the best radio DJ around. But after they play, he's real, just kind of slow and I just think kind of meanders around sometimes. But every now and then he'll catch somebody and they'll kind of spell out why they're doing what they do. And he asked Ramsey Lewis one time, how do how was a jazz band doing this R&B music type of thing? And he basically, and Ramsey Lewis spelled that whole thing out about jazz was too abstract and the people didn't understand it. But other people like Chick Corea and Santana and Herbie Hancock are doing this and boom, boom, boom. And I was like, well, that's gold. That's gold. He put it all. And so I use that. I keep that. And that's not available on your Best of Soul Train that you might purchase and this and that. That's one of those bootlegs I got from Calvin Lincoln back in the day. So it's so crazy. We have to kind of get this history all underground. We have to get this underground history and try our best to put it out there, and maybe others will catch up to it.
Summer of Soul gave me some hope. I mean, I was hoping that it would open some floodgates somewhere.
And I felt that way too. And I'm hoping that Questlove has announced he's doing a Sly Stone documentary. And I hot and cold about that. I'm excited, but I'm like, don't mess this up. Don't do a New York version of a Sly Stone story. Don't start at the top. There's the whole region is what made Sly's music what it is. And the doo-wop vocal group he was in high school, the Viscanes, a lot of those people are still around. And there's ways to really dig and tell that story. And now's the time to do it. We're not going to be, those folks are not going to be around forever to tell those kind of origin stories of this music that I see as, it's not just fun music, Scott. It's like, I had to break this down one time because there's a thing that Scott Brown, you probably know him, he's at UCLA, and he's been working with the folks in Dayton for the Dayton to tell the story of Dayton funk, right? And there's this whole thing of the funk capital of the world, and I'm okay with that. But he worked with some people at there's a private school in Dayton called Dayton University, and they put together the Dayton Funk Symposium in 2018. And somehow I was late hearing about it, but I went there, and it was very well done, and it was a scholarly thing. But I got to meet all these Dayton funk legends a generation late, right? And that guy, David Webb, I don't know if you've checked in with him.
Yeah, I've had him on the show, actually.
Okay, that's good. And at that time, he had a facility so we could walk in to a funk museum, and it was glorious. It was spectacular. And you had Zapp's uniforms and Sun and all this, recognition of all these people. And who walked in that day? Doug Wimbish walked in that day, who is from the Dayton area. And he had all these, stories just kept coming out, I'm like, this is a beautiful thing. This is a great thing. I love the way that story's getting properly told. And Scott has a book on Dayton funk that needs to come out. And I would say any day now, but we got issues that slow us down sometimes when you writing and then once you write, you have to say, okay, this is enough. And then you got to publish it. That's a whole other thing. But he's been doing all this. And so those Dayton people asked me to do a talk for the second one. And I said, okay, well, let me map out some of this funk history that's in the book. And there's the thing, I think it's on page 20, where I talk about how all the funk things, how all these different styles come together, how gospel and jazz and rock come together to be soul and black rock and jazz fusion. And then you have the great funk bands. And then from the funk bands comes disco, comes house and techno and hip hop. And when you step back and look at it, everything relevant in the music currently, all these traditions went to the funk, and then all these other things came from the funk. So what does that mean? Let's look at the funk and how it happened, why it happened, and what it is. And I remember because they wanted to publish it in some little pamphlet, and I had to work with those people. I could do it if I had Photoshop anyway, or where you just draw your little layout. And I was like, damn, I've been kind of saying this, but that's what we're living. That's why we're doing this, because the funk is this kind of centerpiece of the change from pre-modern to modern music, right there. And just about every artist will tell you that, and every show you go to, you'll hear these bands that, okay, lets you know that we can hit it. And I mean, I remember when I had a girlfriend in high school, she wanted to see Boz Scaggs. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad you like somebody we can go to the show together and see. And he opened playing Lowdown, right? And I was like, yep, I don't blame you. He wanted to let you know he could play it. He didn't want you to spend the whole show waiting for him to play it, but he wanted to let you know he could play it. And so I was like, okay, I get it. And he got it. And that was, I don't know if he's still around, but that's, a cornerstone of his act. And for a lot of people, that's their act. And they know that. And some people, I mean, you and I, we can talk about how hardcore some of this funk is. Sometimes people have no fear of funk, and that makes their music really, really enjoyable. And we can tell that. The other day, I played some Ahmad Jamal. Ahmad Jamal is a sophisticated jazz man, but every time I hear him, there's a little bit of a little nugget in some of his stuff. I'm like, okay, I get it. You're not afraid of funk. Same with that Ramsey Lewis. It's like, if they want it, if it was needed, it was in their bag of tricks.
They're at least informed by it.
I love
that. As far as like funk being swept under the rug, I don't know about you, but I had high hopes finally when I would say it was like by the early 90s, started hearing like funk and like, advertisements to the mainstream. And it was like trickling in all these places to mainstream America that it had never been before. And I was thinking, wow, it is finally going to take hold and it's finally getting mainstream. But it did not. It didn't do anything really for those true funk artists. I don't get that at all.
It's a tough one because I was noticing it. I had little kids around that time, and it was in the Shrek movies, and you can hear Shining Star. You can hear some of these funk songs in the kid movies, and that was cool. And then I kind of realized a lot of those were made by Pixar in Emeryville, and these Bay Area folks, animators, understood funk, same generation as me, that type of thing. But it's tragic for me from both ends. And because this time of year, they always list who gets in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm like, do I got to go through this again? Do I got to go through just the abandonment issues again? And again, that happened. So no Rick James, no Ohio Players, none of the great funk bands, no Bar-Kays, no Cameo. These people have been like in the mix for 50 years. And not only is rock and roll thing is tough because going all the way back in back in the day, a lot of those bands disappeared from pop radio. And so a lot of these folks that are somehow in charge of the myth of rock and roll and this, they didn't even hear a lot of the funk in the late 70s and 80s that these artists were still pumping out. And so they don't even know what Cameo was doing besides Word Up. Okay. They don't even know what, Lakeside was doing, if they even know Fantastic Voyage. Right. But wait a minute, these people have been here, all of our lives, putting, and giving us joy for generations. And not only the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is not ready, there are no institutions in place that can recognize what these artists have done. And that's like, well, wait a minute, we don't have, there was a bit of a thing when Obama was president. He would have these events and people would perform. And I remember when Esperanza Spalding got up there and performed Stevie Wonder, Overjoyed, on stand-up bass and vocals. And I'm like, that's some classy stuff. That's some pretty nice stuff. There's an opportunity for that classy dimension of our music to be recognized. That's a beautiful thing. That's nice. Now, did they have, I don't know who did Earth, Wind and Fire play the same day. I mean, there were a few inklings of around the stature of that sort of the cultural dimension to the Obama presidency, gave a little bit of sort of insight as to what could be done to recognize these legacies of contemporary music, contemporary Black music. But I mean, obviously, a lot of things have flipped and gone in the opposite direction. And it's really tough. It's tough to watch these bands break up. It's tough to watch people because they don't get a chance to officially retire comfortably. They don't get a chance to say, hey, I'm not playing anymore. I respected what Morris Day did when he said Last Call. That was his album, The Last Call. And, I'm going to close up shop here. And it felt right and it felt good. And I'm like, you captured that moment, guy. And I respected that. And then I see he's on the bill to play again. So I guess it was just good, a good promotional gimmick. But
musicians don't retire.
They don't retire until they can't breathe anymore. And we're kind of spoiled by that, right? Because we kind of still want them, and we still want new music from them, a new mix from them. We still want that magic. And what is that magic? It's sort of a lost it's a lost feeling, and we don't have the the literature that works around it, that captures that. And this is what I was trying to say about Scott Brown's book on Dayton funk. That's a generation, the 70s is just a generation that doesn't get written about. Scott, you probably have those soul music books, the Peter Graunicks, the sweet soul music. There was just so many books about the 60s soul sound. And they're good, they're great works. But comparatively, there's next to nothing on the 70s sound that puts it in perspective. And you know it because you've written about it.
We share so many common frustrations like that. We both, at the time in the 80s, there was nothing serving that. And, the only stuff was by, rock critics that had no regard whatsoever for funk and, hardcore black music. So I know that inspired you, inspired me, but also so much aggravation and frustration about it too, It's just not just, it's injustice, right?
And people just fell into these grooves, and it's like, well, hip hop, is making something out of nothing. And it's just sort of the survival mechanism. And it's just out of deprivation comes inspiration. I'm like, well, that's okay. That's sort of a narrative that's been around. But there was this other narrative of folks that had means, had the support of, families, could get a garage band together and do these things, and formal musical training, and church musical training, and the streets that they was rolling around in, and put all these vibes together. And the rhythms that you make connect all these loose threads into a groove. And that's what you do. And that's what funk can do for anybody. But folks they're not ready for this conversation, man. But
well,
that's why
we're trying to affect change. That's
why it's important that you continue to do what you do. I don't know how you find the time to do it. I mean, are you retired?
I wish I was retired. Yeah, no, it's hard, man. I put in tons and tons of work and hours just to do it.
Yeah, and it's about the love. And I try to explain that to people about the radio show, because the daytime at the radio station is news, it's journalism, and they pay the journalists to do what they do, and that's great. While there's still a budget at KPFA, that's another story. But the late night people, the music people, the culture people, we just do it for the love of it, right? We don't see any money. As a matter of fact, we're told not to see any money out of it because it's a nonprofit institution, yada, 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 yada. So we totally do it for the love. And, I would do it anyway. And, if I'm not on KPFA, I'd be somewhere else and maybe doing podcasts like yourself. Because I just feel like it reflects so much that could be meaningful, could save the world, but it could be meaningful. And so that's where I've always been. And it's hard to keep things going consistently sometimes. I think people want and need and live for the funk still, even if it's not as clear cut and visible to them to this day. That's my feeling.
Well, that's the beauty of the internet is they can get access to it if they look for it, whereas for a while it was almost impossible because so much of it was not even reissued on CD for the longest time, and the internet wasn't really hopping yet. Those were some dark times, man. Funk.
So who are you listening to nowadays?
Well, of course I listen to, all the good stuff as much as I can. But I listen to the new stuff too, as much as I can, because I always want to hear new stuff. I like that Skunk Mob, the P Union, now the Skunk Mob. That's a good record.
Those guys are down there. CM Talley gave me a LA Maggots shirt. I need to represent with it. And, but it's been a while since they had some of those lazy, just afternoon jams. And people go out there and mix and just vibe on it. And that's that's a beautiful thing. Yeah, every chance I get down there, I try to catch Jara and Slapback because those guys do it for me.
Oh, they bring it,
whatever
man.
Whatever he comes up, whatever incarnation of his family band, maybe he'll be playing with his kids in the band next, decade, and he'll still be popping with it. And I personally think every municipality has their own Jara Harris and some of their own LA Maggots type of collective of funk people. And maybe when you catch some of those P-Funk guys that are touring, I suppose if we asked them, I think they know. I think every time they go to another big city, they kind of know the half dozen folks that are represented that have been coming since the 70s and 80s to check them out.
I definitely got more hope when, these groups came in from the jam scene, like your Lettuces and your Galactics and Deep Banana Blackout and all these groups that kind of came, a lot of them white guys who just embraced the funk. And I mean, to me, they're in the pocket. I mean, they're legit, a lot of those guys. They're not just doing it. They're doing it,
And I've noticed how Bootsy seems to always hear who's doing something. And now he's real quick to collaborate with them too. And so when I saw him do that thing with Lettuce, Bootsy is just, he's keeping up with the funk better than we are, man. He's always tapped in a little bit ahead of the game, and even if he's not touring, he's definitely bringing it and giving it, and that just you can't do much better than that, man.
There's much more to this great Truth and Rhythm interview. Just continue on to the next part of the episode. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you've already done so, please share it with friends. And become a member by joining Truth and Rhythm on Patreon or consider donating at funkinstuff.net. Thank you very much.